Thomas Merritt, whose son William Hamilton Merritt, commanded a small force of Canadian militia cavalry. And Merritt, in his journal, which he wrote after the war, said he had many a long, hard ride after Willcocks and his volunteers at night. There were pistol fights at night in the Niagara.
Welcome to the Stories of 1812 podcast. We're here today on location with Donald Graves, writer, author, historian on the War of 1812. And today we're going to talk about Joseph Willcocks.
Joseph Willcocks.
Yeah.
In my opinion, Canada's worst traitor. In the opinion of a dissolute few, a hero, a patriot, I disagree. Joseph Willcocks is a very interesting person, but I think it would have been better for Canada had he never been born. He was born in Dublin in 1773. His father was not a wealthy man. He was a member of the Anglo-Irish not aristocracy, but gentry, which ruled Ireland. His older brother Richard was a solicitor, became a solicitor, and Joseph, being a second son, didn't stand to inherit anything. I don't think his father had much. So in 1800, he came to York to live with a distant relative, William Willcocks. And shortly after he arrived in York, he was hired as a clerk foreman by Peter Russell, who, in the absence of a governor, was the administrator of the province. The dates, 1800, are so close to the time of the uprising in Ireland. There was an uprising in 1798, commonly called the 98. Many people in Upper Canada suspected Willcocks of being a member of being an insurgent, but he was able to give his references the names of the two senior British generals in Dublin during the uprising. I don't think, and there's no real proof that he was a member of the United Irishmen. Anyway, soon after he arrived, he was hired by Peter Russell, the administrator of the province, in the absence of the governor. He was hired as a clerk foreman. Russell had tremendous property, and he was in Russell's household for 2 years, during which time he kept a diary. And he recorded what he had to eat every day in the household for 2 years. So we have an idea what the menu would have been of a household, a well-off household in Upper Canada. When my wife's book, In the Midst of Alarms, she actually collated all the meals. And I forget the exact figures, but I remember one was 442 red meat dishes in 2 years. All that red meat may account for what was to come. In 1802, Russell got suspicious that Willcocks had undue intentions towards his sister, who was a member of the household too, which is actually in his diary, he had said there's a string drawing us closer together, and we know who us was. Anyway, he turfed him out of the house. Willcocks, he had a talent for always finding a new patron. So he went to the house of Judge Alcock, who was Russell's chief opponent, and he lived in Alcock's house. And Alcock, who had some power in York, was able to obtain the shrievalty of the home district, and Joseph Willcocks became the sheriff of the home district. So he was actually well established. He had a sailboat. He attended horse races, and he did a fair bit of drinking. We know that because there's accounts of that. In 1804, Alcock left the province, and Willcocks then attached himself to Judge Thorpe, who was also an opponent of the establishment, as it were. And Thorpe guided him along. But in 1807, Thorpe left, and Willcocks lost his appointment as sheriff and was sort of cast out into the outer darkness of upper Canadian politics and society. He moved to Newark, present-day Niagara-on-the-Lake, and he began a newspaper. And he bought a press using funds provided by the Masonic Lodge in Newark. I have a feeling like there's no evidence, and Masonic records you don't get at, but that he was a Mason. Anyway, the newspaper was the Upper Canadian Guardian or Freeman's Gazette. And from the outset, it was very, very anti-government, especially anti-Sir Francis Gore, the governor. Upper Canada got a governor after Russell. In 1807, he was elected to the Legislative Assembly for his riding, and he was a fairly competent, conscientious member of provincial parliament. He got wolf bounties enacted. He got funds for schools set up. He was reelected in 1808 and in 1812. But in the Legislative Assembly, he became the center of they didn't have political parties. It wasn't that advanced. But he became the center of an anti-government faction, and it was joined by other members until at one point they had nearly a majority amongst the members. As 1812 came, and the threat of war was was there, and Gore went back to England on leave, and Major General Isaac Brock took over as president, governor of the province, as well as military commander. And Brock went before the assembly and tried to get several measures to prepare the province for a war, which included partial suspension of habeas corpus. So there was the problem was in the province there was a large population of Americans who'd come in the previous decade, attracted by cheap and free land. You could get 200 acres. All you had to do was swear an oath of loyalty to the crown. Many didn't. And the numbers, the percentage of them, various historians have various numbers, but I think around 40% would be right. So 40% of the people of Upper Canada are recent Americans. Brock was aware of this and thought that if the United States attacked, these people were going to be like a fifth column inside the province. So he tried to get these measures to prepare the province for war, but Willcocks and his faction were able to defeat them. He prorogued the assembly and called it again in August 1812. By this time the war's on. Tried again to get these measures enacted, and again Willcocks and his what Brock called his vile coadjutors were able to turn it down. At which point Brock prorogued the assembly and went off to fight the Detroit campaign. Brock then set out to convert Willcocks to his point of view, and Willcocks was flattered with his attention, and at Brock's behest he went on a mission to the Grand River nations. He'd had a lot of contact with them. We don't know what kind, but he was known. He went on a mission to the Grand River nations to convince them to join the British side. They were neutral at the beginning of the war. The Battle of Queenston Heights, he was a volunteer aide-de-camp to Brock, and over the winter of 1812-1813, he was regarded as a very enthusiastic supporter of the war effort, and was recruiting for the incorporated militia, a unit of more or less long service militia, which they were setting up. And things seemed to be going well until the American offensive of the spring of 1813. At the end of April 1813, an American force landed in New York, captured the Capitol, burned the Legislative Assembly buildings, and then went over to Niagara, Fort Niagara, where they joined another large force of Americans. And on the 27th of May, landed at Newark and took Fort George and pushed the British back. The British commander Vincent withdrew back to Burlington Bay. There was a depot, British depot at Burlington Bay, about where the castle is, that museum. Dundurn Castle, yeah. It was right around there. So Willcocks sees this. He sees the Capitol seized, the Legislative Assembly burned, the Legislative Assembly was not sitting, and again, it's a case of he always finds another patron, and he can see that things look bad for the British side. So 2 weeks after the American Army landed at Fort George, he appeared in the American general commanding was Dearborn, Henry Dearborn, appeared at Dearborn's headquarters, offered to raise a unit of Canadians to help the American Army in their occupation of the Canadian side of the Niagara. And Dearborn accepted that offer. He commissioned him a major. The commission was just on his own authority. It wasn't a regular federal commission. And the other senior American general who was present, Major General Morgan Lewis, who was former Chief Mason of New York, provided funds for his unit. So he gathered a unit of renegades. Most of these people were Americans. They were nominally Canadians, but they were Americans who had recently emigrated into Canada and sort of found themselves trapped. And the unit was about 50 strong, but it was very, very, had an effect out of all proportion to its size because it provided an ability for the Americans to have intelligence. I mean, Willcocks and his men knew the locals. They knew who could be relied upon to give information and who could be relied upon as a loyalist. And Dearborn himself had started off his occupation deciding to be rather gentle to Canadians, and then he got a little harsher and began to arrest prominent loyalists. And Willcocks, that was one of his jobs, was to arrest prominent loyalists. One of the loyalists he arrested was Thomas Merritt, whose son Hamilton, William Hamilton Merritt, commanded a small force of Canadian militia cavalry. And Merritt, in his journal, which he wrote after the war, said he had many a long, hard ride after Willcocks and his volunteers at night. There were pistol fights at night in the Niagara, the odd sword clash. So he was quite a valuable person to Dearborn and Lewis. And in September, when James Wilkinson arrived to take over command, he was introduced to Willcocks, and Wilkinson thought him useful too. And when Wilkinson moved the regular American force in the Niagara down to Sackett's Harbor to take part in the offensive against Montreal, and he left in command a brigade of New York militia under George McClure, Brigadier General George McClure, who was a somewhat weak person. And Wilkins went to Sackett's Harbor, where he met the Secretary of War and offered to help to assist change Upper Canada into a Republican province. Sounds familiar, doesn't it, somehow? Yeah. Returned to Niagara, took over command again, and he got more and more influence over McClure. McClure was a weak-willed individual, I think. Then Major General William Henry Harrison arrived. He just had a victory at the Thames and brought the regular component of his army on to Fort Niagara and the Niagara. And he met Willcocks, was very impressed, wrote to McClure, said, make use of this guy. this guy is very useful. And then Harrison was moved on. And so McClure appointed Willcocks the police officer of the American-occupied section of the Niagara. Now, police officer is a very, very sinister kind of appointment. But what it meant was no one could enter the American lines around Fort George, Newark, or leave without a pass signed by Willcocks. So he had a lot of power. And as the year went on, October, November, McClure's militia began to depart for home because most of them were only enlisted for 3 months. And British scouting parties were moving in closer and closer to Fort George and Newark. And at one point, Wilkinson's a unit of Wilkinson's scouts was ambushed. And this time, 2 other former members of the Legislative Assembly, well, actually, one was still sitting, Benaj and Mallory, a former member, and Abraham Markle, who had been elected in the current election of August 1812, joined Willcocks. These were Americans who immigrated to Upper Canada before the war and had joined or were part of Willcocks' loose opposition faction. They became officers in his unit. When McClure got increasingly nervous, the British and Canadians were pressing him more and more, and he was really restricted. His area under his command was restricted to the immediate environs of Newark and Fort George. And he called a meeting of his officers and showed them his orders from the Secretary of War, in which he was given permission to destroy Newark if necessary for the defense of Fort George. And he showed it to them, and they said, well, you should destroy Newark anyway because it provides winter quarters. If you're going to retreat across the river, burn the town. And I'm pretty sure Willcocks was foremost about burning Newark. So on the night of December 10th, McClure withdrew most of his troops across to Fort Niagara, and Willcocks's Canadian volunteers did the actual burning. They're the ones who did the actual burning, set torch. I think it was about 400 people were turned out in the snow, including a woman who was in the midst of childbirth. An American who witnessed this said Willcocks rode through the town cursing everybody for being a damned Tory and sympathizer. And this American, whose name was Serenius Chapin from Buffalo, said, tried to stop him. He pulled his pistol and pointed at Willcocks, but Willcocks went on with this destruction. So when it was over, he and the Canadian volunteers withdrew to American territory. The British occupied Newark, and Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond looked at the desolate ruins of Newark, which is basically a collection of chimneys. And McClure had not even bothered to destroy the fortifications of Fort York. He had removed the artillery. But Drummond looked at this and said retribution had to be made against the opposite shore of Niagara. And so the British went over one night, prepared, and they captured Fort Niagara. It was a very daring operation, and once the British assault party had gained an entrance to the fort, the interior of the fort, which now is very wide open, and was in 1813 full of wooden barracks, the American garrison then poured out of the barracks to find the enemy upon them, and Drummond had advised his troops to make use of the bayonet, and they sure did, because the casualty statistics were the inverse of the usual order. It's usually 1/3 killed in action and 2/3 wounded. At Fort Niagara, it was 2/3 killed in action and 1/3 wounded. The British didn't have any mercy, and this was payback for the burning of Niagara, Newark. And over the next week and a half, British forces went down the entire American side of the Niagara and burned every structure except, I think, one house in Buffalo. And there was some outrages done too. They killed a few civilians. The interesting thing was that Lewiston Heights, as they advanced, the only unit that was fighting to prevent that was the Canadian Volunteers. So you have this unit of Canadian renegades defending American territory against a British force. Anyway, the British finally ended up in Buffalo, and the Canadian Volunteers, who were now under the command of Benajah Mallory, withdrew with the American forces to Williamsport. I'm not sure. Willcocks had gone on to Washington to see the Secretary of War and to explain. McClure had him wanted him to explain why he had destroyed Newark. And Secretary of War wasn't happy with this. He said, I told him he was able to destroy Newark if necessary to the defense of Fort George, but he destroys Newark and does not defend Fort George. The American government made an official apology for this, and but by this time it was too late. The American side of the Niagara had been devastated. Willcocks got to Washington in February 18th or 14th, had a meeting with Armstrong, and got commissions. His commissions were made U.S. federal commissions, which means that the officers and men would be paid by the federal government, American federal government, and they would have the status of volunteers in U.S. service. He returned back to the Niagara, and by this time there was about 50 men. The strength of the Canadian Volunteers went up and down. Many men went over and joined them until they found their feet or got in touch with relatives and then deserted to go home to relatives in the States. So it was always up and down. But by June 1814, there were about 55 men, all mounted, all well armed, and they were part of Major General Jacob Brown's army. Brown's army had 3 brigades. 2 brigades were regular troops, and 1 brigade was composed of volunteer New York and Pennsylvania militia and Joseph Willcocks' little unit of renegades. So on the 3rd of July, Brown crossed the Niagara at Fort Erie, took Fort Erie, and then the next day, Scott advanced up to the Chippewa River, and the Battle of Chippewa was fought on the 5th of July. Willcocks wasn't part of that battle. I'm not sure what he was doing. He may have come over later than the rest of Porter's brigade, but he was certainly present. His Canadian Volunteers were certainly present at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. But before that, when Brown's army advanced to Fort George, they were very instrumental in leading scouting parties of Americans because their local knowledge was very useful. And I'm pretty sure that they urged the Americans to destroy the village of St. David's, now part of Niagara Falls, on the 22nd of July. Brown wouldn't tolerate this kind of behavior, and it was the New York Volunteers who did the burning, and he cashiered the commanding officer who had said that he was advised to do this by people sympathetic to our cause. And I think what it was some Canadian Volunteers leading his men, and they said burn this village because it had been the headquarters of the British Army the previous year, and so they burned the little village of St. David's. Next we find him at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, and the Volunteers, at one point Porter's brigade comes up the hill, and the Volunteers accompany them, but they're kind of nervous because if they're captured by the British, the result is going to be a short length of hemp rope. So now I just want to sort of interject here. When Drummond arrived in Upper Canada in late 1813, he assembled the Legislative Assembly and reminded them that two of the sitting members were under arms with the United States forces, which is Willcocks and Markle, and said this disaffection has to stop, and I'm going to take measures to do so. So he had the Attorney General of Upper Canada draw up bills of treason against there's about 30 odd people, including Willcocks, Mallory, and Markle. And there was a special assize held at Ancaster in May, and not all of the those indicted were present, of course, but 8 of the men who were sentenced to death for high treason. Now the interesting thing is that the penalty for high treason was been on the books since the time of Henry VIII or long before that. The penalty is hanging, drawing, and quartering, and I'm not going to go into detail. If you've seen the movie Braveheart,
Yep.
That's what it was. Now, by the early 19th century, they were a little more civilized. They simply hanged you and then beheaded you, and the head was shown. And this is Upper Canada. Anyway, 8 men were found guilty, and 8 men were hanged on one day at Ancaster. It was known as the Ancaster Bloody Assize, and this was to be no more this disaffection. Of course, by this time, many of the Americans who'd settled in Canada had gone back across the river, and there was less disaffection because the people who were causing it weren't around. Well, to return to Willcocks, his unit fought at Lundy's Lane and didn't do very well. They didn't want to get too close to the British because this is like, bayonets and muskets. So they kind of pulled back, and they withdrew with the rest of the American army to Fort Erie, and where Willcocks was killed during an attack on a British battery. He was killed. When the news reached the British and Canadian camp, there was much rejoicing. His body was taken across the river to Buffalo. Thank goodness he wasn't buried on Canadian soil. Now, there's a couple of additions there. For years, I tried to figure out where he was buried. I thought it was Genesee. There was some Genesee, New York. There was something that made me suspect. And as I told you, I more or less in jest, I wanted to get together a bunch of likely lads, some lanterns and spades, and go over one night and dig up his bones and bring them back to Canada and have them exposed on a gibbet. That's just a joke. Actually, he was buried on in what they call the Common in Buffalo with several other officers from the American Army, and in the 1830s, they moved them all to Forest Lawn Cemetery, this big cemetery in Buffalo. And there was just one central monument, and they're not individually marked graves. There's a central monument. So it wouldn't be a good idea to dig them up because you might dig up some innocent American hero.
Yeah.
Now, Willcocks suffered probably the worst fate that I wouldn't call him a hero. The worst fate that a historical character can suffer. He became the subject of a really bad written novel published in the 1870s in Buffalo called "The Victims of Tyranny," and it was written by a local. I forget whether he's a tobacconist or a watchkeeper, but it's awful. It's online. You can read it. His Willcocks, or his hero, was Richard, some name, who had a trusty sidekick from Cane Tuck. And these two boys were wandering through the woods one day when they espied a beautiful young woman about to suffer a fate worse than death at the hands of a fiendish Red Savage, and they intervened. And it turned out that this young woman, whose name was Azilka, was the daughter of the American general. And they reunited her with the father, and he was just overjoyed and appointed Willcocks, this character, whatever his name was, I forget now, as a scout in his army. And so there's a lot of fighting and long speeches. And finally, the Willcocks character is mortally wounded, and as he's lying there in the arms of his faithful sidekick Sam from Cane Tuck, he gives a speech that goes on for 3 pages. You know, if I'd been Sam, I would have knocked him over the head, put him out. But it goes on about liberty and fighting for justice and liberty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Is the historical record clear now, you think, in Canada? Because even now, today, right, we have articles that pop up.
Yeah,
Question is...
this is often the case.
Yeah.
I call it the Che Guevara complex. Someone who opposes the government, they might have a good cause, often they don't, becomes a hero. Now, I'm a creature of the 60s, as you can probably tell. And when I first encountered Willcocks, I thought, geez, a Canadian Che Guevara, how neat, how neat. Well, I changed my mind over the years. And by the way, Che Guevara was a rotten guerrilla leader and died because of that.
And contrary to other historians, you've read a lot of the documents that other people haven't.
Where I differ is I got into the American documents.
Yeah.
And I read through the Secretary of War's correspondence for 4 years. It took me a long time, I'll tell you. And I got other documents. At one time, when I was a graduate student, I had photocopies of the muster rolls, these long rolls of the Canadian Volunteers, handwritten, about 8 feet long, and hanging around the walls of my little apartment, which used to puzzle guests. But no, if you want to talk about Willcocks, don't talk about his political career in Canada, because you can't discuss that without discussing his military career during the war. That was my point. And he was very useful. Almost every American general except one praised him, who had anything to do with him.
So hopefully you and I, or you now, have set the historical record straight.
Well,
yeah.
I will. I haven't published. I've been too busy publishing other books, but I did my thesis on them, and I've been collecting bits and scraps since then. And the interesting thing is, his older brother, Richard, became a prominent solicitor and a member of the Irish government, and was the founder of the Royal Irish Constabulary in the 1820s, and was knighted for his efforts. And the younger brother didn't turn out so well.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, ladies and gentlemen, you've learned something like I have, and we've set the historical record straight. Thank you for coming to the Stories of 1812 podcast. Our website is storiesof1812.com. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.